Hello, everyone. Welcome to the ShapingEDU live event. My name is Lara Geringer. I'm the community manager for ShapingEDU. Before I turn it over to Ruben, I just wanted to real quick, for those of you who haven't heard, we are hosting the ShapingEDU Winter Games in January. And you are all invited. It's completely free, a 3-day dreaming, doing, driving extravaganza. We will be engaged in a breadth of activities designed to surface the best in emerging approaches for shaping the future of smart campuses, cities, and education, and life after the pandemic. So I hope you'll join us there. Okay. Now, I'm about to turn it over to Ruben. And Ruben is not only a Black Swan expert, but he has many years in a variety of education change-making activities. His work focuses on transformative applications of information technologies to education. He's implemented these approaches for over 30 years in a range of organizations, and he's the creator of the SAMR model for selecting, using, and evaluating technology in education, which is going to become highly relevant to the Black Swan conversation before too long. And Ruben is also a ShapingEDU Innovator in Residence this year and the groundskeeper of Black Swan Lake, where we are joining him virtually today. Ruben.
All right, so good morning or afternoon, everyone, according to where you're coming from. Thank you all for coming. And today, what I wanted to talk about is a follow-up to last time. So for those of you who were here last time I was talking about system dynamics thinking. I was talking about thinking about, yes, bathtubs, drains, showers, faucets, and then actually seeing, well, that you could make sense out of a range of scenarios, a range of systems with this simple metaphor. So what I want to start off with is to talk a little bit about some things that are happening today in the news that type of thinking can help you with. Because if you've been following the approaches taken throughout much of the United States, countries in Europe, etc., in terms of this wave of the COVID pandemic, you're seeing a primo example for analysis for what happens if the way you decide to keep a bathtub from overflowing is you let it come up all the way right up to the edge of the bathtub, and then you dive for the faucet and you try to shut things down. It doesn't work very well. In general, you wind up with a nasty mess of water on the floor. And what's worse, you find that once this has started, it's hard to deal with the mess, and you're dealing with the mess overflowing, and you still haven't shut off the bathtub, and you're trying to reach for the plug, but the plug isn't draining fast enough for the bathtub. It's a mess. And sadly, joking aside, that's exactly what you're seeing right now, because you're seeing far too many countries, far too many states that have said, okay, we're going to wait. We're going to turn the faucet a little bit down. Maybe we'll let the little top drain a little bit more, but we'll wait and see if that stops the bathtub from overflowing, or in this case, COVID cases from really taking off. And of course it doesn't. And it's the sort of thing that you can model using the tools that we've already discussed, using changemakers for modeling system dynamics, to get more insights on this. Now, I have to be honest with you, this is not something new. Most health policy people in most countries and states will point out exactly what I'm pointing out right now. But I wanted to highlight it as an example of, at the very basic and the very simple level, how you can look at some of these policy decisions and start thinking about them. How would you model them, and how would you get what, well, I'm not going to call them Black Swan effects, because frankly, it's quite predictable that the bathtub is going to overflow. But they are the sort of thing you can prevent or design robust alternatives for, or as we'll get to later in these sessions, antifragile alternatives for using this type of Black Swan thinking. So that's a little bit to frame the context. So what I want to do is put this in context. So I want to start out today by saying, okay, let's start from this perspective that we've already seen is useful, and let's put it in the context of what we already looked at before. So let me, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, because I want to do a build-up that's going to give you some components to build towards this type of approach. And then we're going to see how the role of individuals, as we'll see, starts to take on a greater role and how to look at that. So I'm going to turn on my screen for sharing. And here we go. All right. So a couple of things. First things first. For those of you who were here last time, or for those of you who weren't, who'd like to catch up on things, I want to point you to the Shaping EDU blog. And you can see it right here. And I'm going to paste the URL in the chat space over here, so you have it. And as I go along, I'm going to be giving you lots of addresses. Don't worry if you miss one or two or all of them if you want, because to be perfectly honest with you, all of the addresses, all of the resources I'll be talking about today will be posted to this blog. So for instance, if you scroll down, here's session number 1, the Black Swan Thinking Project, and that contains both the video recording of the session, Karina's superb visual summary of the session, and then all the resources, links, etc., that were used during the session, as well as some additional materials and references. So that's just to get things started. And then for those of you, again, who may not have been here last time, the tool that was used was this tool, Insight Maker. And Insight Maker is a free modeling tool that allows you to look at system dynamics models. And when we wrapped up last time, the last model I showed everyone was this model over here, which is sometimes called a catastrophe model, and it helps you see what happens if you have a catastrophe that takes out the middle population in a transition going from, in this case, young people to adults to elderly people. And one of the things we saw last time was that, in fact, you might say, well, once the catastrophe goes away, the population will recover. And what you find, in fact, is it doesn't recover to the previous levels. And I invited those of you who were here, as well as those of you who chose to join us in Slack for later conversation, to think about how this model can be used to understand what's going on right now in some segments of academia, where, for instance, departmental budgets are being cut back. That in turn means, for instance, that some courses are being cut back. That means that some students are not making it through the pipeline. You can model it by models analogous to this one. So I don't know how many of you tried doing this. I'll throw out there that, for instance, if you take 2 of these models and say you view it not as young people to adults to elderly people, but rather incoming students to students in your discipline to students who will become graduate students and faculty, and you couple 2 of these for 2 separate departments that have codependent or interdependent requisites for courses, you'll find that one of the unexpected effects is you don't just see a dip in their enrollments, they can follow each other into a death spiral. In other words, not only do their enrollments never recover, but in addition to that, they actually drive each other in a progressively deeper and deeper downward state until finally there are no more students left, and both departments and the whole area of the university, it could be, for instance, the Department of Engineering, etc., if we're talking about some science courses and some math courses, shuts down altogether. I mean, that's the type of thinking that you can get from this, again, in terms of what we talked about last time. But today I'm not going to just repeat what I talked about last time. If you haven't tried it yet, I strongly encourage you to play with these models and so on, but we already did that last time. Today I want to talk about what happens if, instead of looking now at these groups as just groups, if you look at them as a cohort, if you start saying, well, hold on, in this case, let's just go back to the model as originally stated here. You are looking at the scenario where if you say, well, okay, this is young people as one big group, and adults as one big group, and elderly people as one big group. But what happens if, instead of today, you say, well, what happens if the young people have a mind of their own? What happens if the adults have a mind of their own? And since they're the ones that are at risk of death, maybe do something that changes their risk of death. What happens if the elderly people regroup in some way that has something to do with what type of adult they used to be at the time of this process? Then we're talking about what we're calling agent theory. Agent theory can build upon system dynamics models. We're also going to see it can be looked at on its own. We're going to be doing both things today. I'm going to be giving you a whole series of toys to play with. I hope you enjoy them. But in addition to those toys, I want to start out by taking a step back. I want to give you a motivation for looking at this. Because if you play with the systems models from last time, you may say, wow, this is pretty powerful. There's some really good stuff here. There's some really good insights I wouldn't have gotten without looking at this. That's great. But there's so much more you can do if you build in this aspect of saying, well, who or what are the components of these systems? But again, let me give you a couple of problems that, while you can look at them from a systems perspective, become richer if you start thinking about them with agents into the mix. And these are two problems drawn from the headlines, as the saying goes. So the first one has to do with the latest IMF report, International Monetary Fund report. And the International Monetary Fund latest report, as you might imagine, is not cheerful given the COVID pandemic, given the current economic situation. But it does have some interesting things that are, if not exactly cheerful, at least hopeful in some ways. And one of the areas that they're looking at, because of the fact that absolutely nobody can look at what's happened with wildfires and with hurricane season that never ends and with flooding that's instantaneous in areas that only flooded occasionally, et cetera, et cetera. And they say, well, okay, look, we've got the whole climate change issue before us. We need to do something about this. We need to reduce the consumption or eliminate the consumption of carbon-based fuels. How do you go about doing this? And here's where the somewhat cheerful or optimistic news comes in. They find out that, well, if you do it right, you might be able to actually get global GDP to go up. In other words, it might actually be not a cost, but a net plus in driving the economy. But here's the thing. You have to think about doing it right. And one of the things that comes out from the report, and this is the diagram I'm showing you right now on screen, is it says the right climate policy mix. And you get this lovely diagram that shows you, that what you want to do is put in a carbon tax. But then you might say, wait, but don't you want to also foster people buying clean energy? So maybe what we do is we subsidize clean energy. And the answer is actually no. If you do the modeling right, here's what happens if you subsidize clean energy. People say, oh, clean energy cheap. I'll consume more energy because all energy cheaper. So here's the problem. Yes, you made the development and sale of clean energy cheaper, but people don't just buy clean energy, they buy all energy. And if you make clean energy cheaper, all energy cheaper, buy more energy, actually drives up carbon emissions in the short term. Now, if you model this using a simple systems dynamic approach, you're not going to see this because people's individual behavior gets lost in the mix. You could do a more complex systems dynamic where you say, well, a percentage of people will buy more as a group. But if you're really modeling this, you start to say, well, what if instead of looking at energy consumption by people as this big blob, what if I start thinking about what individual people might consume and start saying, what if each agent has a sort of encouragement factor for buying energy in terms of how much energy they're likely to buy based upon the cost of energy? And very interesting things, among them this type of conclusion that says, don't use subsidies for clean energy, instead use a carbon tax to make all consumption of carbon-based fuels, among other things, more expensive. Works better to get you that rapid reduction in consumption of carbon fuels without the side effect of you slowed it down because all energy became cheaper and you still get this growth in the economy. So that's motivation number one for this type of thing. And I'm going to have you think a little bit more and talk about this in a little bit when we do a breakout. But let me show you a second motivator for those of you who like a somewhat darker or more depressing one. Not that this is exactly cheerful, but let's look at the next one. I don't know how many of you in the audience, and sorry, I'm just going to quickly paste this into the chat space. So you have this in front of you. There we go. That's the IMF blog. So I don't know how many of you have been following the question of enrollment in post-secondary education during the COVID pandemic, particularly what's happening with community colleges. All enrollment is down. Or most enrollment is down. That's not a surprise in and of itself. What is a surprise, or not entirely expected, is that differentially, as you can see from this diagram from the NSC research group, so let me paste this so you have this as well in your space, okay? You've got a scenario where you're seeing the 2-year colleges, okay? I've just pointed at them right here, are down from the fall of 2019 to the fall of 2020 by 9.5%. Now, 4-year institutions are also down, around 2.1 if they're private not-for-profit, 1.9 down if they are public institutions. Interestingly enough, private for-profits are only very slightly down year to year. So what's going on here? And the interesting thing is that if you look at the history of this, if you compare, for instance, with the enrollment across years for the previous economic crisis of 2008, here's what happened then with community colleges. Again, let me give you the URL for this so you have it. And this is what you get. You should see this now on your screen, that you're seeing that community colleges, okay, after in 2007, were up 4.2. Immediately in 2008, they were relatively down, but they were up in 2009 and then took a drop in 2010 as the economy began to look up. That's a pattern we are familiar with. In other words, when employment goes away, people duck into community colleges, either to find respite. In other words, I'm not working, I might as well enhance my skills, or because they're concerned about not getting a job or preserving the job they have, and they turn to community colleges to do that. Or they simply have open time and they say, well, I might as well. There's lots of reasons why this happens. And this is a model we were familiar with. But what we're seeing here, if I go back for a second to the previous screens, that's not holding this time around. And the question is why? And there are several options. So now I'm going to go for a second to the chat space here. And for instance, Tom is saying that we've raised the barriers to accessing education. Those who barely cleared the bar before are simply refusing to make the jump with the raised barriers of remote learning. Yes, Tom, maybe. But why is it so differentially higher for the public institutions when you compare with other scenarios when we've also raised the barriers? There have been several studies additionally to this that indicate, yes, that's a component. And some people have argued that that's the case, but it doesn't account for the whole thing. Another model that some people have argued is, well, people are not going to community colleges, they're going to 4-year institutions. There's some evidence again, but it's hard to explain what's going on here in terms of all of this. Well, this is exactly the type of scenario where you need to start thinking about, start out with a system dynamics model that's based upon previous experience, what we already had for previous economic models for other economic crises, but start including now an agent-based component that would allow you to think or look at this in the perspective says, well, it's not that we didn't know anything before, but something is changing that system. And yes, you're going to need to throw in 4-year institutions. And yes, you're going to need to throw in an individual factor of how easy it is for that student to access the remote learning or to access the world of the community college there. But why? Which ones dominate? And here's the thing. If you just go on your intuition and say, oh, it's just students being siphoned off to the 4-year system, I can guarantee you that you're going to make mistakes and you're heading straight for a black swan. You're heading straight for a scenario where if you're the 4-year institution ramping up your seats for community college students, you're going to have a very unpleasant surprise come Monday morning. And if you're the community college that says, we just lost them and plan accordingly, you're also going to have a very unpleasant surprise. So Tom, you're absolutely right. It's a combination of factors, but that's not enough for planning. That's not enough for policy design. What combination? How would we model it? What type of things would we be looking at? In the first breakout session, I'm going to give you guys the choice of either one of these two options, whether it's the IMF or the undergraduate, to discuss in your groups, how would you go about building a transition from a systems model, which is what I discussed for both of them, to an agent-based model. Oh, I suppose I should show you how to do that, shouldn't I? Let's do it. All right, so here we go. And by the way, as you go along, please, you'll notice that Tom has been typing comments, questions, etc. into the chat. Please don't be shy. As I say, we're going to have a breakout rhythm to this, so it's not just going to be me talking or me demoing things. I want you talking with each other because I want you hashing out ideas. Remember, this is Black Swan thinking. It's not Black Swan preaching. If I wanted to do Black Swan preaching, I'd be wearing a very special, Black Swan preacher robe, and I'd be, standing before a congregation. Okay, that could get very, very strange. So I think I won't go in that direction. Instead, I'd rather have you guys talk about this, work with you guys to develop the thinking associated with this. Paul has just placed a question in the chat, and it says, Ruben, before we dive into the breakout rooms, would you mind explicitly summarizing again the definitions of systems and agent models? Absolutely, Paul. In fact, I'm going to go one step further and actually show you an example to demonstrate this. So absolutely, you're absolutely right. That is crucial. Let's do it. Okay. So let me also convince Zoom to not do very strange things with my window. Here we go. Okay. Okay, Zoom has decided that no matter where I put my view of the participants, it will automatically stretch it to fill out my entire window. So I apologize for a slight delay there. I think Zoom is happy now. All right, so let's go through and do an example of a simple systems dynamics model and how to take it to an agent model. All right. Last time I did the how-to by pulling down menus, showing you where all the arrows were. I'm not going to do that again this time around. The recording is there if you'd like to do it. So assume that, when I show you each screen, you can go there to see how I assembled this. But let me show you the transition. Let's start with the first one. Okay. So now you should be seeing a model, and this is a model. Since I was talking about COVID earlier, let's use a simple disease model. A simple disease model says, look, first, let me give you the URL for this. As always, all my models are available for you to look at, download, play with. So here we go. That's a simple disease model. And in this simple model, here's what's going on. You have a group, a cohort of people that are healthy. Then they catch a disease that has a certain infection rate that says, okay, in every step of time, how likely is it that somebody's going to catch the disease, a certain percentage of people, and then they become infected. And then there's a recovery rate in this simple disease, so we'll assume there's only a path to the recovery. Sadly, as we all know, with COVID, there's a path to death, and there may be an additional path that says, well, you're healthy, but you can be infected again. In this one, we're going to assume a very simple disease, the simplest type of disease you can have. So you just recover, and that's it. You can't catch the disease again. And there's a certain rate for how you recover. So this is a very simple systems model. Remember, the blocks here we're calling the stocks, where things accumulate, the blocks of healthy people, the blocks of infected people, the blocks of immune people. And then we have the processes, the flows by which you go from being healthy to being infected. So the infection flow and the recovery flow. And finally, we have variables, the infection rate and the recovery rate, that govern how those flows evolve. So you can see that I've made myself some nice little sliders, and the nice little sliders allow me to change how healthy or how many healthy people there are, allow me to change the infection rate and the recovery rate. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Excuse me one sec. I just need to, once again, convince Zoom that I really don't want the menu bar on top of my screen. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and run this by running the simulation. And you can see what happens over time. This is a very slow disease, by the way, so it's something that makes its way through a population in years instead of months, but I couldn't do something like that. And you can see that in this particular case, most people remain healthy, a few people are infected, and some people are immune, but it never takes off. On the other hand, let me close this out, and let's assume I kick up the infection rate a bit and kick down the recovery rate a bit. And let's see what happens. And now you can see that as things are going along, we're still seeing now not quite as many people remaining healthy. So I'll go ahead and stop this. And then finally, suppose I really kick up the infection rate, really kick down the recovery rate, and put a few more people into the mix, see what happens. And lo and behold, now a different curve starts to show up. And now I see a pattern where suddenly healthy people start going down to 0. Infected people are here at the peak, and then they decline as they return to immunity, in other words, post-infection health. So this is a simple systems model for this. And I could do things such as figure out for a given number of people, what's the ratio of infection rate to recovery rate that will yield a particular type of curve where the crossovers come over. And again, we already saw that this could be incredibly useful and valuable. Great. But this is a model based upon these big cohorts, which is why it looks so nice and smooth. It's the big bathtub full of water draining into bathtubs of infected people, which in turn drains into a bathtub of immune people with a certain characteristic to it. All right. Suppose now that we say, okay, now let's break it out. Let's assume that people are not just these big cohorts, but they're individuals. And the next model I'm going to show you is this one over here. And again, let me give you the address for this if you want to play with this model. And this is an agent-based model. Now, this agent-based model is made exactly the same way I showed you last time how to make a systems model, except that you're going to choose, instead of the characteristics for each big set, each stock, you're going to choose, as you see here, for a person, you're going to choose elements of the state of that person. So one person now, instead of a big group of people, is in a healthy state. They go from being in a healthy state via a process of infection, okay, which is a transition. So same thing, except that instead of being a group, it's one. One person is in a state of healthy and goes through a transition of infection to a state of infected, goes through a transition of recovery to a state of recovered. So what we used to do before for a whole group, the whole bathtub, we're now doing for each drop, if you will, in the bathtub. Exactly the same process. Again, I'm going to give you links in the blog post about this for how you would go about doing this, a step-by-step tutorial that was put together by the Insight Maker team. But for now, I want to focus on the results. And then I need to do two more things. I need to define a population, because one person alone, well, who are they going to catch the disease from? Okay. But number two, it's not very interesting to look at the one person that just sits there and never catches a disease. Well, I suppose that person might find it very interesting, but to us, it's not that interesting a process to look at. So I need to create a population with a number of people in it. And you can see here, I have a little slider that tells me there are 200 people in this population. And then I have to do one more thing. I have to do a probability of infection. Now, this is a different thing, because I have to say, well, how many people have this disease? How likely is it, as a percent of the people who are infected, I need to calculate that I'm going to catch the disease. And because it's a person, how likely is it in any given time step that I'm going to recover? So you can see I still have the same variables overall, how many people, likelihood of infection, likelihood of recovery, but instead of referring to the whole cohort, they refer to one person. So let's run this and see what this looks like. And you can see right now that I have the same type of overall picture for the curve, but whoa, it's all kind of wobbly and noisy and so on. Sure, that's because not everybody smoothly in lockstep gets ill, recovers, etc., in that nice smooth percentage of the entire cohort. Sometimes a few people more will get sick, sometimes a few people less. So if I turn this down, for instance, suppose instead of 200 people, I make it 100 people, or around there, 112, say, and run it again. And you can see it even gets jaggier and noisier because, of course, there are fewer people. And what happens with each one is going to affect more the overall picture than if you had 200 people or 2,000 people and so on. So again, you can play with these. You can now look and see a little bit more. So what's the likelihood of an individual person catching this, and see now that there's more of a dependence upon the whole population. So this is step one in terms of thinking, in terms of transitioning from systems to agents. Let me take a quick spin here on the chat to make sure that we have here. So, okay. So Paul's complaining or saying that poor kitty is coughing, and Tom is trying to find cat N95 masks. Okay. Lots of people finding the cat masking meme. Okay, good. We'll see. Let's see if we can get cat masking trending on Twitter today. All right. So sounds good. No, Paul, don't be sorry. Actually, I'm always happy when I see people playing with the ideas. That's good. That's what you want to do to develop Black Swan thinking. If you keep a very grim face all the time and you don't play with the ideas, I can guarantee you that's when the Black Swan is going to, swat you across the face. All right, but let's keep going. Let's take this just a step further, because so far I have this, but I'm cheating a little bit, right? Because instead of really dealing with this as individuals and so on, I have to admit, I kind of said, well, they're individuals, but then they see the whole pool of people around them. Okay, so that's a starting point, but let's take it further then. Suppose now I say, well, hold on, these are individuals, okay? But can I look at them more as individuals? Let me run this model again, but I'm going to change one thing very quickly so you can see something very interesting. So I run my simulation again. You're going to say, okay, Ruben, you already ran that simulation. By the way, notice that every time I run it, it's a little different because each person has a probability. So the likelihood changes from run to run. But let me show you what this looked like if I looked at it on the scale of individual people. Aha, so here we go. So each circle is a person, blue, healthy, infected, recovered. That's at the very end. Let me start from the beginning. So that's what it looks like with this simulation that I just showed you. If I look at it at the individual level, and you go, oh, okay, interesting room, but that's not very realistic. I mean, people are getting sick very distant from each other. And well, hold on, how do you get sick? Oh, you catch it from somebody. You kind of have to be closer to somebody, don't you? Let's build that in. So now I'm going to go to the next model. And now this is what I'm calling a spatialized model. It's very, very similar, except that notice that I don't have the percentage. Let me just show you. Instead, what I have, you should see on screen, and don't worry about the equation. Again, I'm going to send you the links to the tutorial so you know how to type this in, etc. But basically what it says is, look around you, and in a radius of around 25 units around you, see how many people are there. And if any are infected, then there's a certain likelihood you're going to catch it too. That's what all this says, okay? It's written in kind of a fancy way so that the program knows how to interpret it, but the programming language is actually quite straightforward and you don't have to learn a lot of it, just a few key phrases. So this basically says, look around you. Are there people around you within a radius of 25 that are infected? If so, here's your likelihood of getting infected. Roll the dice and see if you caught it on this round. Let's see what this looks like if I run this. All right, so I'll run the simulation. And here we go. Sorry, it's running a little bit slow because I just realized I put 2,000 people in here. So I put a lot of people. So that's why it's looking so smooth. I put So this is, just so you understand, this is running in my browser. So given that not too long ago, I would have needed a massive computer to do this all by itself, it's pretty impressive. It just runs inside my browser. So there's the overall curve. But if I now look at the agent display for this, now it tells a very different story. Let me write it again from the beginning. Ah, you can see this, I think right now. What happened, I'm going to pause this and I'll just rewind to, there we go. So just go, let go, see? You can see that it starts with a clump of people who are infected and then it spreads outwards from there. Ah, so now I've built in the next stage. Now I'm playing seriously. I'm saying, okay, I'm not cheating anymore. I'm not saying, well, miraculously the person knows how likely it is over the entire population that you're going to catch something and catches it. I say, no, no, no. Let's have them actually catch it from the neighborhood, and that's what you see. And again, just so you can see this, I'm going to close this out. And suppose I turn down the population. Now, if I turn down the population, that reduces the likelihood of seeing somebody nearby. It'll also run faster, just so you can see it in action. So you can see the overall curve now remains the same, but where the peaks fall, how quickly they rise, how quickly they fall is different. And again, you'll run this. And if I look at the agents now, if I look at it on the basis of individuals, this is what it looks like. So if there's patient 0 and 0.1. And if I run it, you can see that they spread to the rest of the world, but it's a different pattern. In the earlier one with a high density, things spread out very quickly. This takes longer, even though it does wind up spreading to the world. All right, great. So now I can start doing things like changing the probability. I can change the density, lots of things I can do, and this is legitimate. Let me add one more thing, though. Let me add a little bit of individual willpower to each of these agents. Let me make it so that this is the final model. And again, sorry, I should give you the address for this one if you want to play with it. So 1 second, I need to just move things around a little bit. Here we go. So this is the one that was spatialized. Now let me give you the last one, which is this one, which has what I'm calling avoidance. And in the avoidance model, there you go, it's now in the chat space. I'm going to add one more thing. And the one more thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add as a possibility for the agents, they're no longer standing still. They're going to move around. And if they see somebody that's sick, they hear somebody coughing, for instance, they start moving away. Now, that doesn't mean they're not going to be unlucky and move closer to somebody else that's coughing, but you can start it. Okay, so let's run the simulation and let's see what happens. So there you go. Whoa, the curves are now looking pretty different. I mean, yeah, they kind of have that pattern, but look at what's happening. Stretching out, very, very different things. So if I'm a public health policy designer and I'm thinking about what works, how much does providing people with a, hey, this person is sick type warning helps? Well, it's clearly doing something for me. And let's look at the agent display. So again, I'll just play the whole thing. And you can see this. So people are wandering around, but you can see that they're flying away from the people who are sick. And notice that there's a cluster of people there towards the bottom who, at least thus far in the simulation, have managed to remain healthy. So this allows you to, again, start saying, okay, so how much avoidance? How much does movement matter? Because if I show you how this works, let me just close this out and show you just a little bit of how the avoidance code works. Okay, what it says is first take a random step. You're just moving around, you're wiggling around a little bit. So you're a random walker. And then look around you, and if there's somebody nearby, move away from them by a full step. That's what the second line says. So I could play with this. I could say, well, if I move away 2 steps, what if I stay still and only move if I see somebody coughing nearby? What if the people who are sick are told to not move? We call that a quarantine, don't we? and I can start seeing the impact. I can again start seeing this. And these are all things that we already saw, how much mileage I could get out of the simple systems dynamic models. That was very useful. I could already see the different curves with the big percentages and so on. But these type of behavioral changes, this type of policy that we prescribe by different behavioral changes, that I didn't see. So this is the transition for how you start out with a systems dynamic model that you know, transform it into an agent model, then enhance it to make it really agent-like, and then finally start to say, well, since I have individual agents, what could the individual agents do? At this point, I want to take a break. I want to take a break and send everybody out to now breakout rooms, okay? Because at this point now you have enough material to think about the following question in your groups. The question I'd like you to think about is fairly straightforward, and that is pick one of the two problems I gave you, whether it's the recommendation for the energy approach, in other words, carbon tax rather than cheap energy subsidies, or if you prefer, the community colleges scenario. Which one you want to choose, I'll leave out, you're going to break out into groups of about 8 people, and I'll leave up to you which one of those two you choose. But what I'd like you to do in that group over the next 10 minutes, we're going to go for 10 minutes into this breakout, is to very quickly hash out what would you highlight as the key tubs, the big systems dynamics, if you were thinking about those stocks and flows that you would need to consider. And then how would you refine that by bringing in an agent perspective in terms of what I showed you, just like the example I just showed you. Don't worry about how you'd model it in Insight Maker. That would be a longer question, although I would strongly encourage some of you who might be interested to actually try to take what you discussed. But now you've seen enough to be able to say, well, this is the type of question I could ask. This is what I would do. Why would it be interesting? So we're going to break out for 10 minutes. Laura's going to
Quick
handle
clarification, Ruben, real quick.
Yes, please.
Do you want us to model the cause of the phenomenon, or do you want us to model the a potential response to the phenomenon?
Either one is valid, Tom. So let's take the community college one. You could say, I want to model the cause of the phenomenon because I want to figure out why this is happening. Or you could say, this is happening, I don't know why, but how would I construct a response given some assumptions? I think you'll find that the second one works better if you do the first, but I am leaving it up to you. And similarly for the IMF, whether you want to say model the behavior of individual energy consumption and say, well, let's dig deeper into this thing that the IMF is saying that people will consume more energy. What would I do to construct a model to verify this? Or what would I say saying, okay, given that this is the case, how would I design a policy around carbon tax, energy subsidies, etc., brings this into the picture? Again, don't worry about solving every problem in the world. Just pick a subset of one of these two problems to chew on and figure out how you would start to design a systems dynamic approach and then refine it using an agents approach to get at some of the meat of what's going on. Does that make sense?
To solve every problem, we need at least 12 to 15 minutes.
Okay, you want to? Okay, I'll. All right, I'll be generous. I'll give you 50. How's that?
No, I'm kidding.
Okay. All right. So, okay, we'll compromise. 12 minutes. All right. So let's do 12 minutes in breakout groups, and then when people come back, I'll ask people to do a brief report out of what it is that you discussed. And I'm going to be bouncing between groups, hopefully trying to get to as many as possible to hear a little bit how you're thinking and address any questions. All right. And out we go. Everybody, welcome back. So what I'd like to do is very briefly, if I can ask one person from each group to report out, just take a couple of minutes for a quick report. And one of the things I'm also going to encourage you to do is, so that the conversation isn't just limited to what's going on here, remember, there's a Slack group associated with this project as well. So I'm also going to invite you to join that if you haven't done so already and continue the conversation there. But who would like to go?
I can go for our group. One of the big things is with only, I think, 12 or 13 minutes, we're still waiting for the pizza delivery in that particular room. So we're really resentful that you pulled us back out here. That said, everything you did to set us up for the breakout room and the conversation that happened in that room really added to, at least personally for me, and I think for the other three participants, added to our understanding of this and our appreciation for what you're doing. We sat, while you were with us, Ruben, we sat and talked about the elements that might go into investigating why community college enrollment goes up and down, and compare those two periods, 2008 and 2020. The things that we saw as the variables were access to technology, access to money, the perceived value of education, and there's a fourth one, oh, the number of people using the online access in a home, whether that affected their ability to work or not. And what that led us to was the realization, as we looked at 2008 and 2020, that superficially, those are the same situation, enrollment going up or enrollment going down. But in fact, there were two entirely different scenarios when you got down to reasoning, because 2008, nobody was going online as a result. What was happening in 2008, they were responding to the lack of money. So our understanding is they responded to the lack of money by going to less expensive options. 2020, a lot of it has to do with your instructors are taking you online, and so you have to be dealing with the technology issue and the cost of that and your perception of whether that's worth doing or not. So that turned out to be much more than just creating a model. It turned out to be a really good exercise in looking at a situation and saying, is this the same swan hitting us twice? Is it even a swan? And if that is two different swans, whatever color they are, what can we do to recognize that and deal with that? So really nice exercise. We all came out of it kind of energized. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. That's a great summary. And again, you're exactly right. In other words, this is exactly the type of thing where when you start digging into this, what might appear, as you said correctly, on the surface, it looks, oh, it's the same. It's not. And this allows you to get at those key elements. Karina has a question for you, I believe, in the chat space as well, about the variables. So
I have to look back at my notes. My handwriting is so bad. The fourth one was, if anybody else wants to jump in. Oh, the number of people using the network in a home.
Great.
So really population needing access to online education through broadband. I'm sorry, we couldn't be more concise, Karina. I'm sure there's one or two words that would do it.
No, beautiful. That's great. So how about the other group? Who would like to go from that group?
I think I've been drafted into that thing, even though my camera has once again frozen. That's weird. I guess I'm overusing it. See, this is a problem. You see, I work at a community college and my technology doesn't work right. Okay, so since I find that annoying, I'm going to unplug my camera and plug it back in again. That worked the last time. Okay. Fortunately, I'm not using the camera for a mic as well. No, that didn't actually work. All right, I'm going to go to the other camera. All right, drama over. We had a different kind of comparison, and I do like the 2008 comparison of variables. That would be also something very interesting to look at. We were blessed/cursed with an international presence. And so that immediately took us down certain pathways of comparison in terms of variabilities between two systems of education. And we also did community colleges. If I'd known that Paul was going to steal the idea, we would have gone with climate change, because I don't like being shown up by Paul. And there go my dogs. Perfectly and on time. Speaking of Black Swans.
Tom, your dogs are on my side. That's all I'm going to say.
The one question that came up was whether or not, we had Jeff Miller is at UBC. So one of the questions that immediately came up was this question of whether we're seeing the same sort of impact and effects in Canada as we do in the United States, where their junior college system works differently. Access to education is theoretically easier. There are less barriers on the other side of things. In terms of money factors and those sorts of equations, and maybe socioeconomic divergences. I want to say diversity, because that sounds good. But there's less of a spread there. How are they getting the same kind of effects? Are the lesser schools losing the schools that are perceived as lesser losing enrollment to the schools that are perceived as superior? Are the technology issues the same? While we don't have necessarily clear data, but we definitely gives us some things to look at. And Jeff, feel free to jump in at any time here. But access to broadband is certainly an issue. So get to work, Paul, and fix that. Paul's on our broadband groups. You guys need to expand to Canada too. Apparently they have the same problem. But this rural urban split in terms of as possibly being one way. International student split, they seem to have more of an international student factor, although I wouldn't underestimate that. The school where I teach, Houston Community College, has the most international students of any community college in the United States as a percentage of enrollment. I'm pretty sure in absolute numbers as well. I'm sure that's been a big factor in our disproportionate decline as well. Although that was already starting to fall apart because of the enlightened policies of our federal government with regard to international students as a concept before the pandemic hit. But yeah, looking at two different systems and looking to see whether those bathtubs are different shapes and sizes and whether the agents are behaving the same way in those two different systems is one way to sort of get at the problem. But obviously, looking at two different systems in terms of time is what obviously Paul and his group did. Is another way of doing the same sort of thing in terms of looking at agent behavior. So,
and maybe if I could add, I mean,
go ahead, Jeff.
Coming back to the bathtub, a thing that I was really curious about was how, to think about the agent response really required some perspective on what the system was capable of paying attention to. So, the kind of feedback loops that maybe some of the four-year universities have to pay attention to how students are struggling, what kind of barriers they have, and what kind of strategies they have to try to mitigate those circumstances vary quite drastically according to the resources of the institution and, frankly, whether or not they have the reach to do that. So we see larger schools who are providing subsidies for technology, who are providing technology. They're making deals with vendors to try to reduce the cost of equipment. We've had to set up VPNs in China in order to kind of negotiate the Great Wall, Great Firewall. Those are kinds of things that are maybe easier for some institutions to manage than others. And I think that also has an effect on what the individuals in those schools can do.
Beautiful. Thank you. And I love, one of the things that came out very beautifully from this was, in one case, you're thinking about systems and agents, comparison across time. In the other case, thinking about them same time, but different systems, even though they might, in both cases, seem like very similar bathtubs, and yet something different is going on, right? So that's really important. And I'm very happy actually that you chose the same one. I want to make sure there was a choice, okay? But in this case, I'm very happy that you chose the same one because I think that illustrates beautifully how the combination of the systems dynamic plus agent approach can really help you get at some of these things. And I have one more thing. I was a little snarky when I was talking about the disease model, and I said, well, miraculously, they know all about the contagion, right, for the first agent one. And I said, before I said, well, they actually catch it on somebody else. But notice that approach can work really well if you were modeling this. So for instance, what Jeff just mentioned, in terms of saying the resources available from large universities versus the ones from small universities. Okay, I could do it on an agent level, but that would be exasperating, to have. So this is the agent called the technology department, and then they distribute one computer per person. You could do it, but that's a case where it's okay to say in this institution there's this flow from the stock of technology to these people, and to use the agent view for the more local individual, what's happening at the person level with a distribution within the population. So it's important to realize that there are tiers of approaches. All right, what I want to do in the rest of the time we have today is to encourage you now to flip things on their head. So far I said, let's start with a systems approach, and then from there build out to the agent approach. But what happens if you just start with agents, raw, if you will, from the beginning? Well, you can do that in Insight Maker, but it's not the easiest thing. You're better off with a system that's designed to look at agents from start in this sort of naked scenario. And I'm going to go back to sharing my screen again, just so you can see this. Here we go. And one of my preferred tools for doing this is a tool called NetLogo, which was developed, well, it's got a long history from early versions from MIT, Northwestern. The team has been all over the place. And here's the URL. And it's once again a free tool. It's a free tool that has a web version. Not all of the NetLogo models run on the web. Some require that you download the standalone engine. But NetLogo says, hey, what if you just look at modeling things as agents from the get-go? So forget about these big things and so on. Look at each individual little agent. And to best explain this, let me show you an example. That'll be the easiest way for you to get a hold of what I'm talking about. So this is the easiest, simplest NetLogo model that's at all interesting. It's a random walk. What do you do in the NetLogo random walk? Well, you push here where it says, okay, so this is a little bit of code that's been written. I'll show you what the code looks like in just a second. It's actually not very frightening once you look at it. So you click setup, and there's one agent called a turtle in this case. And if I tell it to go, it just walks at random and leaves a little trail behind it. Now, if any of you are thinking, gee, this reminds me of what Dr. Seymour Papert used to do with one turtle and Logo and so on, bingo. NetLogo is, as its name might tell you, a descendant of Logo, except so it's designed to keep the simplicity of Logo. Remember, Logo is designed for kids who are 5 years or younger to pick up the language. So it retains the simplicity of Logo, but it's designed with the idea of agents interacting with each other. Let me show you what the code looks like very quickly. So this is what the code looks, and that's it. That's all it's taken. So basically, you set it up. It says create turtles, make the color yellow, set down the pen, and then tell the turtles to move, choose a random direction and take a forward step. That's it. Again, you can look at the code on your own time. Again, I'm going to just put the link to this in the chat. Remember, I'm going to put also all of these in the blog post, so you don't need to worry about not getting one right now. There it is. I know it's a much longer link, but that's it. So just to show you, for instance, if I want to change this and now create two turtles, it's really difficult. Instead of saying create turtles 1, I type create turtles 2, recompile the code, and now tell it to set up. And now we have two turtles walking all over the place. All right, fascinating. So I can do lots of walking turtles. But the thing is, once you have this tool, you can build out systems that are much harder to think about from the big system stocks flows perspective, and just thinking about what do individuals looking at each other, interacting with each other look like. So rather than trying to teach you NetLogo right now, which would definitely not work, or get into the programming, I'm just going to run through a smorgasbord of systems, and as I go through, tell you about some of the classes and get you to start thinking about this, and then I'm going to ask you to play with these, because some of this is going to be important for thinking about agents. Some of this I'm going to encourage you, and again, as I mentioned, I'm going to have this blog post, but I'm also going to have some post inside Slack to give you a challenge, just like I mentioned the challenge last time, a challenge to use NetLogo to think about and to explore. But let's look at a few key classes of examples. So here's one example. This is a model that's based upon the work of Schelling, and the work of Schelling was on segregation. And the question was, can you have a scenario where people are not intending to be segregated and yet they wind up there? So in this model, you have a number of agents with a certain density of population. And you say, well, how many people in their neighborhood would they like to look like them? Okay, well, that's class, race, ethnicity, whatever it is, doesn't matter. You use in your mind whatever model you want to say, well, these are not people who are particularly, they don't say I want 100%. They say, for instance, well, I want about 30% of the people around me to look like me. Okay. So if you do that, you put them on this map, and then you say, well, allow them to move until they're pretty happy. So you do that. and we're off to the races, and they'll keep moving until nobody can get any happier. And here's the interesting thing. Even though they only said that they wanted to see about a third of the people around them be like themselves, so 2/3 are very happy to have them not look at all like them, look what you wound up with. You wound up with pretty segregated neighborhoods, and roughly most people are seeing about 75% of the people around them look just like them. So this is an example of this type of unintended or unexpected behavior that can result from agents that you would never see otherwise. You might say, well, if 30% of the people want somebody to look like them, you might do the calculation, wind up, most people would have about 30% of the people looking like them. And yet that's not the case. They wind up with, as I say, these much more segregated neighborhoods. And of course, one of the interesting questions would be, well, at what point do certain transitions occur? What happens if you say 50%? Okay. And you can see the type of patterns that emerge. And again, now if they wanted 50%, you have 86.5, almost 87% of them see these segregated neighborhoods. So this is one example. What's being created here are certain patterns from the interaction of agents. That's the first one. Let's keep on looking at patterns. Here's a second one that I've used to look at a question of student retention. Okay, and I've looked at this actually in K-12 education. Some people ask me and say, look, we have a problem. When we're looking at retaining students, we see these fluctuations, and we're not quite sure what's going on because we think we're a pretty good school and we're doing fine, and yet we suddenly see these weird transitions where suddenly everybody stays or everybody goes. What's going on? And it turns out that, again, you can think about this from a perspective of an agent model. And in this case, you can view it as a model where people are talking with each other about the school. And this is what's sometimes called an icing spin model. So again, I'll put a link to it in the chat. All right. And in an icing spin model, it's very simple. You say, well, look, I can either be heads up or heads down. Okay. So either my kid stays or my kid goes if I'm the parent. And whether my kid goes or stays is based on a probability based upon how many people around me I hear say good things or bad things about their kid staying or leaving. Very simple model. Doesn't get any simpler than that. Would you expect that to make a big difference? Well, let's see. If I do that and I say, okay, the probability of them is spin up or spin down, you can see what happens. It doesn't just remain all random. You start to see groupings of people who might decide to, yeah, my kid stays, and groupings of people who say, no, my kid goes. But the main impact is not how good the school is, it's who are they listening to. So then, of course, this says, if I'm dealing with this black swan, I have to come up with a communication strategy so that the parents are listening to more people. One of the things I can do, for instance, is I can say, well, what happens if, stop this, oops, sorry. What happens if, for instance, I put some goodies in the basket? So I put some goodies in the basket, and just a little bit more, I'm going to sweeten financial aid. So I'm going to set up, go, and now notice what happens. You now see a much larger proportion of people staying than going, but it's much more than you would have predicted if you had just said, okay, how much will 10% financial aid get me? Because it affects the communication rather than whether people are really in need of that financial aid or not. So that's another example where the agent view is allowing you to deal with a black swan in a fashion that's different from what you would do if you had just gone in with, well, I'm just going to spend $5,000 a person, so take 90% of financial aid because clearly to make a big impact, I must spend a lot. They say, no, just enough will tip the balance, but you would never have seen that otherwise. Let's keep going. So far, these have been patterns that have to do with the states of those agents. But what if those agents can do things? Now, here I'm going to take an example that's a lot of fun, but you can actually make it parallel to examples from education. And in this case, it's termites, okay? Now, anybody here have termites? If you do, I'm very, very sorry for you. They're horrible little creatures. Okay, but one of the things you know with termites is that you find these neat little piles all over the place of wood chips when you have termites. They're a dead giveaway for termites. And the question is, do the termites know, or do the termites want to send a signal, take us to your leader by building wood chip piles? The answer is no. It turns out that you can create a simple agent model with termites just walking around at random, and the termites just know to do two things. One, pick up a wood chip if you're near it, and two, if they're say, when you see more chips nearby, just drop it, okay? So all they do is just pick up chip, and then wherever they see more chips nearby, drop it. They have no idea what's going on, and yet, watch what happens. So here we go, random termites, random chips. You'd think that would just give you randomness, and yet, look what happens as time goes by. A pattern begins to emerge. Now, you can say, okay, fine, Ruben, that's termites, but I'm an educator. Unless I'm teaching entomology, why do I care? Because a lot of things that we do have this sort of characteristic where we might not think about it, but we say, okay, students, you know, you have this, you have no idea why, but bring this together with this other thing and something will result, and certain patterns will come out already, all right, but not necessarily because you intended those patterns to be there. So sometimes this type of creation of objects that you never expected can be a result of visualizing the agent type of activity. All right, let's go to the next one. Those termites. Okay, these are pesky termites. You'll notice I'm having trouble getting them to stop. I think I'm going to just close the termites out. There we go. What about another lovely little animal? Ants. Now, one of the things about ants is, if you've noticed, if you have a picnic, it's the old, and the ants found something, and suddenly you have one ant, and suddenly you have 1,000 ants eating your picnic, okay? Cue the Bugs Bunny cartoon or whatever your favorite animation is. But again, how do they do it? Do the ants say, hey, man, there's a really good burger that way, so just head that way and you'll get a burger? They kind of do, but they don't. And this is an example for how a local behavior by an agent can trigger a much bigger global behavior by a group. So I'm going to set up the ants. I'm going to set them up with 3 piles of food, and all the ants are going to do is they're going to walk around at random, but as soon as they get some food, they hurry back to the nest, and you're going to see they leave a trail of pheromones behind them. Now remember, no ant is saying food is that way. They're just leaving a random pheromonal trail, but watch what happens. So they're going out, but as soon as they get food, they start leaving a trail, and notice that they don't exactly mark a path, but the probability goes down. And look at the chart for how much food is in each pile. The first pile just got devoured. The second pile is not long for this world. Notice that the third one is mostly untouched, and all they're doing is just wandering around the place, etc. But now you see a pattern. Piles 1 and 2 got devoured, and now pile 3, and some of the ants are following the other. I'm going to stop. I'm going to encourage you to play with this, okay? Oh, there you go. So you can see pile number 3 getting devoured. And again, this is a behavior you would not have predicted. If you did this as a system dynamics model, you would have a uniform, all 3 piles going down nicely and neatly. You could change it a little bit, but this type of behavior really requires an agent to look at it. So this is a case where what's being created is a pattern, a map on the landscape, even though nobody or no particular ant has the whole map. The collective action creates this map and the result. All right. Now, I'm going to show you one last model because it has to do with the name of today's session. Now, remember that today's session was called How the Leopard Didn't Get Its Spots. So how the leopard didn't get its spots, well, how didn't it get it? Well, some people say, oh, you must have a gene, and the gene says, put a spot here, and put another spot here, and put another spot here. nice theory. It first started would take a huge amount of genetic code and nobody knows how it would work. Alan Turing said something much simpler. He says, look, suppose each cell can have two states. It can either be pigmented or not pigmented, and it can secrete one of two substances. One substance that stimulates other cells, including itself, to produce pigment. Another one that inhibits, in other words, reduces the likelihood that they'll produce pigment. And there are different parameters. How far it can diffuse, how far it can appear, etc. Well, these substances are what he called morphogens. And if you think about it, well, you can view each agent as a cell in our friend the leopard. So the leopard's skin is a set of morphogens. Each morphogen, these cells are, with these morphogenetic agents, are the system of agents you're looking at. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up, random at first. So for these particular set, let's let it go over time. In this particular case, we're not getting a leopard. We're getting something that's more like, some of the patterns you might see in some insects and so on. If I change some of these parameters, so let me change, for instance, the radius of the cells, just so you can see, the inner and the outer radius, etc. For all of these examples of code, by the way, you have. And now you get something stripier, more zebra-like. It turns out that there's a paper, which I will put a link to in the blog, that has analyzed this and found that a very simple system like this can account for all the patterns you see. Zebras, leopards, tigers. All of the patterns that you see can be accounted for, not by saying, and the zebra has a gene that goes stripy, stripy, stripy. No, it's this type of morphogenic process that Turing said could probably account for it. They have this. An example where agent activity gives rise to a bigger pattern, in this case, how the leopard did get its spots. So that's what I wanted to cover for today. There's going to be more in the blog post and more in Slack, and I'm going to encourage you to look at both. But now you've seen how, on the one hand, you can go from system dynamics to agents, and how, on the other hand, you can take agent systems and start to see buildups of patterns, the buildup of objects, etc., that you would not see, you would not create otherwise. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with a bit of suspense for the next session, the third one in this series, is we're going to start where we left off today. We're going to pick up with these individual agents, and then we're going to say, but what if the agents are connected to each other? What if they start talking, not just because they happen to be next to each one, but there are actually connections, networks among agents. And we're going to see that things get even more interesting in terms of Black Swan thinking. So to close, Karina, if you would like to put the concept sketch on screen, I'm going to stop sharing so people can see your beautiful work. All right.
Wow, fantastic. We've got agents, got little notes from the breakouts. This is great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all. Any last questions before we call it an evening? If you like, type into the chat space. If not, I will bid you a good afternoon, morning, evening, wherever, whatever time it is, wherever you are. And I will see you all in Slack and at the next session.